Last show of the day. Let's get through it, right? Yeah, so if you haven't been in my other presentations, Jeremiah Vardiman, I'm with UW Extension. I'm located up in Powell, Wyoming. Glad to be down here in Cheyenne and talking to you guys. So I covered soil in the last two presentations. Now they want me to talk about irrigation, and those two interplay in my mind. You got to really work those together. But we're going to talk about irrigation management for Wyoming plats. So it's going to be a very broad topic and very broad discussion. But if you guys have specific questions to your niche, let's dive it into that. The thing about irrigation is it's scalable, okay? So this doesn't really matter if you're talking about a small raised bed, container, up to a full garden, or up to commercial agriculture production or lawn production. These principles all apply. It's just how you overlay them, okay? So irrigation for, let's see if I can use the screen today. Nope, still not using it.
I can be your assistant.
Okay, appreciate it. So the overview, what I want to cover is talk about what's the importance of irrigation. That one's pretty common sense, but we'll just talk about it. I like to start at a defining point that we can branch off of and work at. Fundamentals of irrigation, how are we going to look at this? What's the science behind it? How does that interplay, and how do I know about it? Dive into irrigation systems, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And there isn't like a, yes, this is how you should be doing it, you're doing it wrong. It really is a pros and cons of trying to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And then trying to apply that knowledge. And that's what I really want for you, is when you leave, you can say, I can take something and go back and do it on my place. I can change what I'm doing or improve, or hey, I'm doing it right, okay? So the first thing that I really want people to understand is when we're applying to soil, especially gardeners. I talk to people with gardeners, they're always worried about, oh, I got to put in organic matter or fertilizer, do these things to improve things. But really the biggest soil amendment that you are applying in a growing season is water. It's going to make the biggest impact in your soil, and not just in the terms of that water for the plant's growth, but you're actually changing you can, depending on the water and the water quality and source, you can be impacting and changing the quality of your soil because of that water that you're putting on, and the volume and amount that you put on is the biggest one. Yep. So the big takeaway that I want you to understand, this is what we're going to talk about and build to. So I'm giving you the aha moment at the end of the day. If you don't monitor how much water you're putting on and how well it's performing in the soil and what it does in your soil, that's the number one thing you need to be doing. That's the takeaway. And we'll talk about how to do that, but that's what you need to do. So I get phone calls a lot to where people are like, I'm watering my lawn. Am I watering enough? I don't know. Are you? Did you go look, right? And it's not necessarily important so it's a ratio, it's a math equation, so to speak. But really what it is if you're not monitoring how long that moisture stays within your soil profile, then how do we know if I'm watering enough or not, okay? It doesn't matter, and because of your irrigation systems are all different, right? Depends on the pressure, depends on the flow rate, depends on the nozzle or orifice that you're using and the system that you're using of actually how much water you're putting on, right? But it's not necessarily about how much water you're putting on, it's about how much water is available in the soil profile for your plants to grow, which is the most important. And if we don't monitor that to some degree, then how do you know how to manage? Go ahead. So I work from definitions. I like definitions. It helps get us all on the same page and move forward. And so, of course, the purpose of irrigation is, this is my definition, okay? I should clarify that. To uniformly distribute water across an area to provide optimal plant growth, whatever that plant growth is. So if you're talking about trees or turf or vegetables, or if you're in agriculture production and trying to grow a big 100-acre cornfield, right? That's the whole purpose of water. You guys get that, right? But the importance is to uniformly distribute that, right? Are we doing that in this picture? We're missing the ball. Everybody should be able to be like, oh, there's a problem. Let's go fix it, right? It's not always this obvious, right? And depending on the scale or the size of the area that you're trying to water, your soil isn't always uniform and will not always take that water in the same fashion. You might have a hot spot, you might have a dry spot, you might have a rocky spot, you might have a hard pan that's not letting it drain. whatever that is. And so it's not always uniform, and it's not always that easy, right? It's different on the north side of the house versus the south side of the house. It's all different, and you have to monitor and adjust, or else you could run into significant problems, right? Okay. I don't think this is a shock. If this is a shock to you, maybe you are new to Wyoming, okay? But this is average annual precipitation. We're not talking about the growing season, annually. So most of this precipitation could come in the form of white stuff, okay? If you look at that map, what is the color you see most of? Tan. And on this, it's really kind of hard to distinguish, but the tan, a lot of it is this less than 10, and there's some areas, Cheyenne is one of them that's a little bit shade different, it's hard to pick out, but it's 10 to 15 inches of moisture annually. I come from Powell, we get 6. You lucky ducks are 12. You do better than us. The thing about it is when you come up to my area, we could give a hoot if it comes from the sky because we have irrigation water from the mountains and we have all we want. And my water turns on April 15th, shuts off October 30th. It's like a faucet. It's all delivered irrigation water in the canal system, right? It's interesting up there in the Bighorn Basin. Some of the farmers, it's not that they hate the moisture, that they don't care about the moisture, but when it rains, it screws up the field work. Have you ever heard of people that are mad because it rained? Most farmers are like, we need rain, bring on the rain, right? But it's just how it is. But even at 10 to 15 inches of moisture, and you could probably get into that regime as you get closer to the mountains, or even, I know up in the Bighorns, if you get tucked up in those mountains, you could even hit 18 inches of moisture in certain really micro bands within that. And so you can do quite a bit. But the reality of it is we can't rely on annual precipitation, especially for certain production that you want to do of certain plants, right? So we got to offset this, and that's the whole purpose of our irrigation. That should hopefully not be a surprise to you, and if it is, maybe you're in the wrong state. Are we good there? Okay. Go back. I jumped myself, sorry. So the other aspect of that is if we rely on Mother Nature really slaps us around and she's cruel and she'll toy with you in terms of that moisture does not always come when you need it or when the plant needs it, right? She'll give you a big dump. She might dry off completely, however that works, right? So we need to even that out, again, in terms of uniformity. So there might be times or periods of time where you need to turn your irrigation off because there's plenty of water already, okay? Let's now jump. Okay, if you're in my soils class, we already talked about this, but if you weren't, we got to catch you up. Now, if you take a plant, any plant, and you take that entire plant and weigh it, 80 to 90% of that live weight of that living plant is water. That's how critical it is that we get our irrigation right, because that's the number one thing and driver that's going to have into that plant. And so we got to really manage that. Okay, next one. So irrigation is key. This is also off of that last presentation. For excessive soil moisture, what we need to look at, and you need to understand the plants that you're growing and what their, so to speak, requirements are. And the example I gave in that soils class was a cattail. Cattails like anaerobic environments, which means the water and the soil is saturated, right? Let me say that backwards. The soil is saturated with water, okay? And what that does is sets up an anaerobic environment for that plant to live in. There's very little oxygen for the roots to grow in. Majority of plants need a lot of oxygen for their roots, and so we got to manage that. So if we get a plant that doesn't like anaerobic environments and put it in there, you can actually drown that plant, suffocate it essentially. Okay, so we need to know that plant and what its requirements are. And a lot of times if you grow house plants, you fight this. And there tends to be a lot of overwatering of house plants. Oh, it's got to be thirsty. That small pot, give it some more, right? But the plants sit there just soaked full of water, right? And it doesn't always leave room for oxygen. You can run into other things. It can leach nutrients if you're doing too much irrigation or too much precipitation. You can get into nutrient deficiencies because of the soil, but also because of irrigation and that. We're trying to hit this happy medium, right? That's where we're maintaining that healthy plant, whatever that healthy plant is, okay? But if we get to the opposite end, insufficient soil moisture, you can get into those drought conditions. The plant doesn't look very good. It's not very thrifty, doesn't grow, produce very well in that, okay? Pretty easy, pretty common. You guys seen this before? Okay, let's see what we do about it. So we're going to talk about the basic fundamentals of irrigation. Go ahead. So this is what everybody wants to know about, how to do. And they will call me, like I said, and they said, well, I set the hose for 20 minutes. Okay, good. How's it do? Well, it's good, but things aren't doing well. Okay. And they say, well, how long should I set it for? Why? I don't know. How am I supposed to know? Right? What is your pressure? What's your water source? You know, what's actually coming out of the hose? How far in the soil is it going down? What type of soil do you have? I can't answer that equation off of the phone. But people want to know, how much water do I put down? When do I water? And how do I water? Well, it's simple. Go out and look. Pay attention, right? So if you want to get into the scientific facts of it, or how it works and how it functions, and if you get into the high level of production, maybe vegetable production, commercial agriculture production, this is what they are driving on and working on, is evapotranspiration rate. And they call it ET for short. And they will actually monitor the ET rate and start setting their irrigation practices to the ET of that time period, right? And so this ET is ever evolving because it's influenced by environmental factors. So solar radiation influences that a lot. So if you have cloudy week, that's going to be less solar exposure than if it's a bright sunny day. Does Wyoming have very little solar exposure or a lot of solar exposure? A lot. A lot. And you will learn that, especially if you start growing indoors in a high tunnel or a greenhouse. You can actually get over solar exposure to where you're burning your plants, and you might have to put a shade cloth on just to cut it down so you can grow those plants. You're like, but I put that up so I could grow plants, and now they're burning. What the heck, right? So solar radiation is part of it. Your temperature, wind. Do we have any of those here? Not at all. Never. Right. So think July. You're banging around 95 to 105 degrees, right, for daytime highs. You're having those hot, dry winds that are 20 to 30 miles an hour. What do you think's happening to the ET rate? Whew. Right? The demand. So you can look at it as the ET rate is the demand on the plant for water. Okay? So what is ET? What is evapotranspiration? It is a combination of evaporation and transpiration. So they are very similar but different. So evaporation is any water or moisture off of the soil surface, the plant surface, anything of the surface, okay? Transpiration is water through the plant. So the plant's absorbing that water through leaves or through the roots, and it's going through the plant. And the combination of those two ET rates, evapo and transpiration, is your ET rate going up, or the demand of water. Okay? Now this might twist your noodle a little bit. Is an ET rate higher or lower before a storm or after a rainstorm? Higher, would you say before or after? Why?
What was the answer?
Higher, after the storm. So the ET rate's going to be higher after a rainstorm. Why? There's more water available, specifically on the soil surface, right, and in the plants, right? So it's opposite, kind of counterintuitive to what you think. You think the demand would be more before the storm came, when the soil's dry and all that, but there's more water available to evaporation and transpiration after an irrigation, after a moisture event, right? Are we good there? Do you understand that? And it doesn't always have to be irrigation. It could be rain as well, okay? But what do we care about? Do we technically care about the ET rate? How do we manage the ET rate for our plants, whatever the plant is?
This is supply and demand issue.
Okay, explain that. Supply and demand issue.
So if you're going to supply, you have to know what your plant wants, and you have to have enough to meet it. So it's a supply and demand.
Okay.
And the
Right.
plants can demand water. You have to be able to supply it when it needs it.
Exactly. So our plants are going to demand water. We need to supply that. But where do we supply the water? Where's the water at that we watch to say this is my supply? In the soil. It's the soil moisture, right? So we got to monitor that and manage that. Does that make sense? And that is going to change with the crop development. So the demand of water for seedling plants, new plants, is way less than mature plants, right? So plant stage growth maturity is going to dictate demand on water as well, okay? The time of the season is going to change that, right? So in the spring, we're not hitting those high temperatures. It's cooler. We tend to get more moisture in the March through May time period, right? So the demand or the supply is more available and the demand is less, okay? So it's those kind of combinations that we got to manage and watch for, okay? And if we don't do it right and over-irrigate or have over-precipitation, we can have runoff, which we lose that water and it's not available for us, right? Okay. If you want to learn more and geek out and nerd out on that, there's a bulletin for it on evapotranspiration. If you look up bulletin B-1293, evapotranspiration with the University of Wyoming, you can put that in a Google search. University of Wyoming publication B-1293. You have a good chance of pulling it up. If you can't find it, get a hold of your local extension office. They'll help get it for you, okay? Next one. So I already covered this, but I just wanted to illustrate the other aspect of it is, so with your plants, your water demand is going to change. And so this is for grapes specifically, okay? This one's actually for a table or juice grape. And interestingly enough, depending on what you're growing and what type the plant is, there's even differences within the plants. And so this is for table and juice grapes. And if I put the chart up for wine grapes, their water demands are different. Wine grapes take, if I remember correctly, less water than table and juice grapes for a water demand. And so all this is saying is this is the growth stage of the year and where that water peaks out, okay? But you see at a certain point, growth stage-wise, the water demand shuts off in terms of what the plant requires. Does that make sense in terms of growth stage? What would that growth stage be? At maturity, but what maturity? So we're talking grapes, they're perennial. Fruit development, right? Typically with plants, it's sexual reproduction, right? So if you're thinking of corn or grain, right? Once they've produced that fruit or that seed or that reproduction, the demand for water is done after it's done that. Does that make sense? So there's a maturity, and this maturity is always different for each crop, each plant, depending on how you're doing it. Now, if you're growing something like trees or ornamentals, flowers, things like that, it's going to be the same thing. But for trees, we're going to have to continue. Same with grapes. We can't just, okay, we reached the peak that we want, and now shut off the water. We got to maintain that water, but it just doesn't exponentially grow. Does that make sense? Okay. If you get into annual plants, like certain flowers, oh, your hand's up. Go for it.
So you're saying basically that you need to understand the plant's water demand. My question is, what resource do you go to figure out? Like, do you just Google at large, or is there a resource you go to where it's like, this is the water demand for blah, 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 blah?
Yes. Good question. So the question is where do you go to find the water demand? And there's an individual water demand per plant, right? They're individual and different. Right, yes, you are 100% correct. It's out there. It's a little bit hard to find. It's a little bit hard to navigate. I'm going to try and get you past that. So if you want to really geek out and nerd out and monitor the ET rate and manage this and be micromanaging of that, you can do it. is what I'm going to tell you. But let's continue a little bit, and if I don't answer it, let's revisit it, okay? So I'm taking this in a less specific manner, and not that high level, okay? Because maybe this will answer your question. Because what's most important is, and this is what everyone wants to know, how much is too much, right? It really depends on this point. This is what we're monitoring. This is our supply to the demand. If we always manage our supply, the demand will be there, right? It'll be met is what I mean. The demand will be met. Does that make sense? And so you can tell excess water, okay? So if we irrigate, or you get a rainstorm or precipitation event, and you have water pooling on the surface and it's not going anywhere, you are currently at the excess water. Okay? If we've, not always with our rainstorms, but if we've irrigated properly and we have the right system, we will essentially fill the soil profile is what we want. And we will get that soil to what's called field capacity, or the most water that the soil can hold. Okay? And so we're not worried about the pooling. You actually need some pooling when you irrigate. That is needed. That is good. What you don't want to see is that pooling lasts for days, weeks, kind of thing. There's something wrong there, we got to fix that. We're either putting too much water on, or we don't have good drainage, or there's an impactive layer that doesn't allow the drainage, whatever. We got to look at that. Typically, in a good functioning soil that has good drainage, you're going to have that pooling, and within hours to a day, that pooling's gone. Some soils it might be 2 or 3 days, but if that pooling goes away, at the point that goes away, you're at field capacity. That's the most that soil can hold, period, okay? Do you understand that? Are we good?
I have a question.
No questions, I'm explaining it perfect. Go ahead.
Does a low water table have anything to do with that as well?
So does a low water table have anything to do with it?
If your water table is
Higher.
A high water table. If your water table is close to the soil surface, is what you mean.
Right.
Oh, heck yeah.
Okay.
Totally, yes. Depending on how shallow that water table is, impacts this, and will impact what plants you can grow, and depends. So yes, let's talk about it a little bit more at the end, and get into more specifics. If we allow this available water to draw down for various reasons over time, we will hit eventually a permanent wilting point for your plants. And if you hit this threshold or get drier, and it's really hard to get drier than that without oven baking, like physically taking the soil out and putting it in an oven, at this point, your plant will die. And at that point, it doesn't matter how much more water you put to it, it will never come back. You're at the point of wilt. And this is not the point when my plant goes, I'm wilting, I need water. That is prior to this permanent wilt point. But if it's not addressed before that, it will die. Okay, so we got to balance between those two levels. Okay, go ahead. I know what you're thinking. You're like, you're not getting there. We talked about this in our soils. Okay, and so what it is, it gets back to that thing of you got to monitor that available moisture in the ground to know where you're at. And so in sandy soils, you have less moisture that you can retain than you do. The loams and everything in the middle have the most capacity, but if you get too fine textured, you actually lose it again back into the clays. And so all that's telling you is how much moisture you can retain in the soil and is available to the plant. Think of it like a battery, okay? Does that make sense? Go again. So this is when people want to know when to irrigate. Some can do it off a crop condition. They can walk out there, they have enough experience and see their crop and say, I need to water. The crop's ready for more water. Some do it by a feel. And there's a resource to help you understand that feel for moisture. Some do it on a personal calendar. Well, I'm only home once a week, so I'm going to water. Okay, or twice a week, right? A lot of times our lawns are in that category. Some look over the fence and go, well, my neighbor's watering, I better too. Sounds like a good idea, okay? I'm not sure I'd trust that one as much. Unless you live by somebody that has like just an immaculate place. Soil moisture sensors, and this gets into what you're talking about. So you can actually put sensors out there that monitor the soil moisture, and you can dial it in and, with the ET rate and irrigate to that. That's the level that you're talking about of the irrigation demand. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I know this is a general conversation.
No, go ahead.
Sometimes it blends what you put in the ground versus what you might put in a raised bed versus if you have a plant that loves it rich and moist versus a plant. It's sort of the question of how do you know what the plant's requirements are? Like if I have a seed packet versus a plant from the store.
Yep.
How do I figure that out?
Yep. Okay, we'll try and get there. I see what you're saying. Yeah, we'll try and get there. I want you to understand, and you're hitting on it a little bit, but I want you to understand that not everything is created equal. And I know these aren't probably the crops that you guys see or grow, but this is more agricultural, but you can see it with lawn and turf. But it depends on where you grow, depends on the water demand of that crop or plant, okay? So as an example, Torrington is closest to us. You need 22.4 inches a year of irrigation of water during the growing season to maintain that, to grow a lawn. You go to my area, you have 28.4 inches. That's the difference of the ET rate. Do you see that? Okay, look at Sheridan. Why are you living here? Go to Sheridan. No, just kidding. But Sheridan, it has less demand on it. It's lower elevation. They probably have a little bit more humidity. They're tucked up closer to the mountains. They might get a little bit more precipitation, right? So that's where the ET just demands and dictates. To your point of how do I know how much a plant needs and what it doesn't, the number one thing that you can't overrule is experience. You need experience growing those plants. The packets, the books, all the literature can tell you what it needs. But the packets and information will tell you, like, this plant favors shade. If it's a shade plant, it's going to favor a little bit more moist soils. So it can't be planted on a south or southeast facing part of the house because those are drier soils just because of how intense the solar is and it has no protection, right? You know your growing area. You're like, that place is always dry. I have a hard time getting water there. Or if I put water there, it's just gone and the rest is not ready for water. Those kind of things. And you got to be able, it goes back to the thing of the right place, the right plant in the right place kind of concept. So it fits into that. But how do I know? Are we good with this? Does this make sense? Go ahead and hit the button. Did you do it? Why did you screw it up? Oh, you pulled a Jeremiah. It's a good one. Okay. What I'd encourage you to, so there's crop condition we can deal with of knowing when to irrigate. So we talked about how much, and I'll pull this all together. And we talked about when to irrigate. This is now when to irrigate. So let's go to the next one. So crop condition or plant condition. And this again, you have to have experience doing this, walking out there, observing your plant or your crop of how it is. But these are grapes, okay? And so you can see a progression with water stress. Rapid growth, it's just very vigorous. It's doing well, it's very supple. You can feel the leaves, you can feel the stems, the tendrils, and they're just very plump, full of water, very vigorous, right? And a lot of it has to do with these kind of Y-shaped items, and they're the tendrils and what they use to grab on and pull themselves with. With slowing growth, those tendrils get smaller, and they get back to a point when you almost stopped, right, and dead tips, there's no tendrils. So if you know the plant you're growing and you have enough experience with them, you can watch that water stress happen. And it's really experience if you want to learn it by crop condition. And that's how those people, and usually it's very gray-haired people that have done this for 30 years, and they can walk out there and grandma or grandpa or whatever, they're like, oh, we need a water. And you're like, how do you know? And it's just that. Years of experience in growing that plant. But you can tell, I mean, even now with with whatever experience you guys have, you can tell when a plant is doing well and not. And it's just making more observations to seeing the minor changes in that plant as that water goes away. Does that make sense?
So going back to your first point about how the plant's like 80-90%, if you're going out to your garden and you're seeing stress in your plant, should the first thing you look at be the water situation versus any other growing condition, because that's probably your issue, versus it's too windy, it's too hot, it's too...
So, okay. Should I look at water as my first problem if I go out to my garden or to my plants or whatever? I'm not sure if I'd say bang on that's 100% what it is, but I would tend to lean towards irrigation first. Okay? A lot of the phone calls and things that the extension officers receive, a high percentage, I'm going to throw out a terrible number that's not even accurate and not supported by nothing, but like 60 to 70% of the calls and the problems are water, especially with trees. Especially with trees. If we're talking shrubs and trees, water is the issue, okay? Next slide, please. So if you get experience, you can do that. This is with the NRCS office. They have these nice little pamphlets, and they tell you how to detect the moisture availability by feel, okay? And it's dependent on your soil structure and things like that, but it's a really good thing. Again, you got to get experience with it, but just with this pamphlet and somebody explaining it to you and you going out and doing it for a season, you'll figure it out. Give you 2-3 seasons, you can start figuring that out with just that, okay? It's fairly accurate. It's really a good way to do it. And I like this because it's low tech. Anybody can do this. You can go do it. Does that make sense? And it has to do with how the soil works and how it clumps together or lack thereof. Tells you kind of the moisture that's in it and what's available. Does that make sense? Okay. You can go to this method. I don't want to put you off of this, but this costs money, okay? Soil sensors are not 100% accurate though. And there's different types of soil sensors out there, and those soil sensors can be affected by the soil types you have. They'll work better or not work as good in a soil. I tend to view these and think of soil sensors as our elite people that are going to be growing. So if you are a commercial producer, you might want one of these. But if you are, I'm growing food for my family, I'm taking care of just my property, my lawn, it's just my home hobby use and enjoyment, you need a way out if you're willing to spend that money and if it's really going to benefit you and return you. If you want to get into the ET rates of the plants, and that is very much PhD scientific work. Majority of producers, commercial producers, don't go to that level. They're using the refined versions of that. Does that maybe answer your question a little better, okay? These are good, they're a method, but if you don't use them correctly, they don't tell you accurate information, and then you're not irrigating correctly. Does that make sense? Don't want to deter you from them, but they're a total knowledge within themselves. Okay, that boils us down to getting the right irrigation type, okay? And it depends on the type of plant that you're growing, right? Your source of water and the area you want to cover, okay? So think of trees. They're going to be totally different in terms of an irrigation type versus garden. Doesn't mean you can't use the same irrigation type for it, but the plants and how they need water and how much water they need are different. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go to the next one. So the different types, and we're just going to walk through them. And I want you to understand that this is not a matter of saying you're doing it wrong, this is the best type of irrigation. It's really a pro and a con, and you got to weigh out, am I willing to do it manually? What labor am I willing to put in? I want it more automated, that kind of thing. And it depends on the terrain, it depends on the soil, it depends on the plants think of our definition, to uniformly apply that water to that area, right? So surface irrigation, this is more a crop production, commercial crop production, I understand that. But even hand watering, if you go out with a hose or a watering can. It's the same concept, okay? The pros, this really can fill the soil profile because we're putting a lot of water on, and if we're doing it properly, we fill that soil profile completely. That is a benefit. That is awesome. That's a huge battery reserve or supply for the demand from our plants, okay? Let me explain this to you up in my area where we have high ET rates. The farmers will go out and flood their fields. These are siphon tubes, and this is a surface irrigation system. They put the water down the corrugations, and it soaks the water across the beds, and they are fully filling the soil profile. When they do this, especially early in the spring, they don't have to go back and irrigate that field for another 10 to 14 days between irrigations. That's significant. Now, that irrigation timing shrinks up over the growing season as we get hotter and drier and the crop matures, okay? But in comparison to a pivot, which I'm jumping ahead, but is aerial application of like sprinklers, right? A sprinkler, you're never going to put that much water on that's going to fill that soil profile that full to where you don't have to water again for 10 to 14 days. You're going to probably have to come back in at least 2 or 3 or 4 days to water with a sprinkler. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's inexpensive because you don't need much technology, much equipment to do it. You just kind of get the water there, right? Longest periods between irrigation fills the soil profile. So the cons, large volume of water. You need lots of water, okay? And in this system, they have a tailwater ditch that collects the excess water and gets it off the field, okay? So they're running lots of water across it to accomplish this. Uniform distribution. If you have not level, it's uneven terrain, it is really hard to push water uphill. It's really hard to get that water to uniformly cover everything, and that's before you get into the soil anomalies. It is very labor intensive. You need to be home, you need to get out there and spend 2 hours with the hose and get it all done. Does that make sense? Okay. Next one. Sprinkler irrigation. You guys know this. Think of your lawn. It covers a big area. You put a sprinkler out there, it tends to cover a very large area in a short time. It will do a benefit of, for the most part, as long as things are functioning right, uniform distribution, and they tend to work pretty well in uneven terrain. You don't have to have smooth terrain to get that uniform coverage in that uneven ground. Problems with this in certain areas, specifically I would highlight in crop production. So if you're doing vegetable production, a garden type setting, overhead watering really raises your potential for disease problems. Can you overhead water or sprinkle water in a garden? Oh yeah, yes you can, okay? Will it run into some problems? You can. That's the thing you gotta manage. It is influenced by climatic conditions. So if you're watering at the wrong time of day or whatever, or I'm thinking big windstorms, really hot summer days, and you're in the middle of the day watering, are you really getting that water to the ground? No. And you can actually see in certain situations to where if you are sprinkling and you have, let's say, the week or 10 days of really a lot of winds, that side of the wind, it'll be dry on that edge. Okay, so they're affected by climatic conditions. Moderate expense. You got to buy some stuff. You got to get out there. It depends on how elaborate of a system you're doing. Okay, are we good? Let's go to the next one. Drip irrigation, and I'm putting soaker hoses in inclusive of that. They're slightly different, but the difference with them is it's putting the water right on the ground. So this is a type of surface irrigation. However, it's more precise. I want the water here, especially with drip irrigation to say, my emitter's right here dripping water. That's where I want it. I don't want it over there, okay? So this is typically classified as the best, right? So if you want to talk about waste of water, surface irrigation is the worst. You're utilizing a lot more water to accomplish what you're doing. Sprinkler is more efficient, especially for bigger areas. Drip irrigation is the most efficient you can be with your water. But you got to be careful. What happens with the most efficient system? If it breaks, it's temperamental, and if it breaks, you can run into problems quicker, okay? Drip irrigation and soaker hoses put the water right down on the ground where you want them. Soaker hoses, you don't have control. Where the hose lays, it just kind of oozes out. And on the soaker hose itself, it's not uniform throughout the hose, right? So some spots might get more water than other of the hose. But what you're trying to do with a soaker hose is very much like what we talked about with the surface irrigation, that you're just trying to soak the area or soak the bed. So it's more of management of the soaker hose, which you're trying to do. Drip irrigation, it's very efficient with that water, depending on how you want to do it. Soaker hoses or drip irrigation comes in various types. There's a flat tape that will inflate when the water comes through it, and it'll shrink. There's others that are a solid tube that don't shrink. There's pros and cons to both of them. There's some drip tape that has the emitters built into the plastic tape that you roll out. And you get those emitters at different interval spacings, and that depends on what crop you're growing. They're typically used for vegetables, okay? So those emitters might be 6 inches apart, or they could be upwards of 2 feet apart, I think, 18 inches apart, something like that. Then there's others that you can, they're a solid hose. If you attended the irrigation panel, they showed some of that, where you can make your own and put the holes where you want them and put your stuff in there. I wasn't always a fan, but you can do that, okay? But when you get into these type of things, they're very efficient with the water, which can be good. It applies what the crop needs, and it doesn't fill that water profile. Does that make sense? We don't have much of a battery or much of a supply for our demand with this, okay? So what does that automatically tell you with the irrigation of this system? What was that? Increase your frequency. How often you have to do it. You got to stay on top of it.
If you go, there is a mathematical equation for this though. If you go to dripdepot.com, in their resources section, they have an article that actually will talk to you and give you the mathematical equation based off of what type of hose you buy, how far apart the holes are in the hose, how long you want to do it, and then it'll tell you at 1 to 2 inches depth, this is how much water. And based off the calculation, you can figure out, well, I need to have that bed on every day for 15 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever, depending on the bed size.
Yep. So
It'll only push water so far too.
Exactly.
right. But that's the point of this. You're 100% right. It's an efficiency of it, and so you can do the math and calculate it all, right? But the problem is it does not soak that bed or that area, that soil profile, to where you don't have to water for 10 or 14 days. It is only supplying the water and meeting the needs of the plant, right? And you do need to do those calculations to do it correctly, but you're going to struggle to fill that soil profile, okay? I'm going to call this the higher end. It's more expensive because you have more parts, more pieces to put in. If you want to do automation, things like that, okay? And I'll get to that next. But this is also affected by water quality. So especially here in Wyoming, if you're pulling off of well water particularly, and you have hard water, those emitters will plug up over time. So you got to deal with those. Rodents chewing them, things like that. So there's just more to repair, but less labor, but it's more expensive, right? But the big thing I want to tell you and highlight is this. You're not filling that water profile. So you really got to stay on top of it and be diligent with that irrigation and making sure that you're not falling below your irrigation requirements of your plant. So as an example with this drip irrigation, I see a lot of times where somebody will hire, and no offense to lawn care businesses, don't take it that way, okay? They'll hire that lawn care and they'll come in and do the landscaping, plant the trees, do all that, and they'll put this drip irrigation system in. And then about 3 to 5 years later, we're getting phone calls at our offices saying, my trees are dying, what's going on? They set that whole system up and they calculated it all and they did it all, but they planted these trees at this, not at this. What do you think the water demand went? What do you think the water demand is doing? The same or less. Okay? So it's management of that. Okay? A lot of times they also put the drip emitters right at the base of the trees. And as the tree grows, the roots are out there getting water, not here. Right? So it's management. Okay, next one. You can automate those systems, the soaker hoses and that, in other things. This is an image, of course, of a greenhouse, and they get very automated, all kinds of controls. But it can go into just a mechanical timer on a garden hose, right? Or an electronic one that you can actually program, Okay, so you can get automated and you can spend as little or as much as you want and how elaborate you want it to be, or you can put it in one of those in-ground sprinkler system that gets up more into these kind of controls, lower end controls. All right, so I want to try and tie this all together and applying your knowledge. So the knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. So I want to try and get you, we know the knowledge, you understand it, I think. And even what you came in with, you understand irrigation, but I want to try and get you to where you're applying that wisdom. But I can only get you so far because you have to have the experience to develop that wisdom to where your grandmother or your grandpa could just step out and be like, we need a water today, right? All right, let's go to the next one. I am a big fan of this. Keep it simple. Jeremiah, you just talked me around in circles. What for? Just tell me the answer, okay? And it gets back to your point and your questions, which are all good and targeted. Do you want it complex? Do you want it simple? Okay? And for a majority of us, if you're not making a living off of this and it's not your livelihood, simple will get you by. And even in that setting, simple can get you by. But if you are trying to be push the envelope and be very competitive and drive things, getting to the more complex is almost necessary. And that's where I see the soil sensors are at, things like that, that automation technical, right? You balance that wherever you want it. But the reality is, whatever your system is, go set it. Irrigate it for your set amount. Monitor it. Don't be like me where I set the hose and I walk out and go, oh, shoot, I forgot to turn the hose off. I don't know how long it's been running for. The well's dry. Gosh, right? Set a timer for yourself. Use your cell phone. Whatever you got to do, right? Set it. After 12 to 24 hours, go dig a hole. Jeremiah, you're telling me to do work? Are you kidding me? I got to get on my hands and knees to do that. Okay? There's also you probably have heard of them, but they're a soil probe. You can use one of those as well. They can be very beneficial, but if you're in rocky ground, they really suck. Or if you get in hard ground. What? They're worthless. I like it, yes. But you don't got to get that deep, okay? We're talking 6, huh? You use an auger. You might want to move properties if you got to use an auger. Oh, man. But you want to dig a hole. And it doesn't have to be a huge hole, right? But you want to get down 6 to 12 inches. Okay? And it depends on what plant you're looking at and where you want to be concerned about. But overall, a high percentage of all our plants are absorbing moisture in that top 6 to 12 inch range. A lot of times it's really amazing to me, and I understand the confusion of it, but trees, a lot of times people think trees are going deep in the ground and pulling water out of the ground. Very few trees have tap roots that go deep. Most of those are surface roots that are 2 to 3 feet deep at the deepest, right? And so just monitoring that 6 inches to 12 inches in your soil will do a lot for you and understand it. So go look at it. Monitor that soil until it becomes dry while observing your plant's condition. Do I mean like sit there and watch it until it goes dry? No, I'm saying go dig a hole after you've irrigated. Look at it. Wow, I can tell where the soil moisture is, right? Where the line is. And if the line of what the moisture is only 2 inches down, did I irrigate enough? No, so what do I got to do? I either got to irrigate again more often, or I need to irrigate longer, whatever my system will allow me to do. Does that make sense? Okay? And so you want to look in that soil, and over time, I look at it, wow, the soil profile is full, it's all hydrated, fill your hole in, go on about your day. 2 days later, go dig you a hole again, look at it. Oh, the line's up here now, fill it in. Oh, now the line's up here, right? Just monitor it, watch it. Just that simple observation makes a huge difference. And if you're doing that at the same time you're watching your plants, especially in a garden, you're sitting there going, wow, I can see that they're drying and the leaves are starting to kind of cup a little bit. They need some water. At this point, I need to irrigate. Do it again. And now you know I need to set it for longer. And you are calibrating your own irrigation system. Does that make sense? Adjust and repeat. And then after you've done that, I'll say 3, maybe 4 seasons, you'll get a pretty good handle on I'm overwatering here, I'm underwatering here, and you can move and dial that around. It really can be that simple. So what is the problem with it, though? Labor and hard work and remembering to get out there and my busy schedule not getting in the way.
Have you ever heard the quote that says experience is the hard teacher because you use the test first and the lesson after?
Yeah, I like that one too. I should have thrown that one in. Yeah, let's do the next one. Okay, so irrigation concerns, aerial watering, I talked about that. I would encourage you. Doesn't mean you have to, but in a vegetable production garden setting, I would recommend you not do aerial watering. If you can get that on the ground, surface irrigation, soaker hoses, flooding that garden, however you got to do it. And some of you might be going, I don't know how I can do that over my big garden, right? That's why I use the sprinklers. It covers a big area. But this is the second level for us in extension. What I mean by that is like we walk into somebody's garden and look at their plants. If there's a problem there, the first thing is we look at, are you watering enough, right? And if you are, then we're good. The second one is, okay, if we start seeing disease issues or insect issues, it's very possibly how you're watering is driving that in your garden. There's other factors in that. So the density and the crop canopy can influence that a lot, right? A thinner canopy will let in airflow and dry that out. So even if you're aerial watering, it will dry out and you might not run into many problems, okay? Just a concern, right? Establishment versus established. So if you're growing perennial plants, especially trees, just understand, especially if you hire someone to bring in that sprinkler system for you, the irrigation for establishing a lawn, establishing trees, establishing a garden is totally different than once they're established. And you've got to change your irrigation accordingly, okay? A lawn, I'm trying to establish a lawn. I'm going to water, the seeds are very shallow, 1/4 inches, maybe at most. I need to keep that top 1/2 inch to 1 inch moist, okay? So I need to irrigate very frequently, very short durations. That grass germinates, it comes up in little seedlings. I'm still doing the same thing. Because one big puff from Mother Nature of hot, dry wind could just dry them out like that, right? You know it, you see it when you start getting 2, 3 leaves off of that grass and it's getting a little more robust, a little bit stronger. I can now start, and I need to start irrigating longer, soaking that ground deeper because I now need to keep 2 inches or 3 inches moist in that soil because those roots are starting to grow down, right? And once I get to a point where I can mow that, so we're looking at, I would say 10 inches of growth, 8 to 10 inches of growth on that grass where I can start mowing it and feel confident that I'm not going to kill it, I now can soak that really good and stretch out my frequency of that irrigation, similar to trees, right? So you got to adjust, right? City water, these are a lot of complaints that come to me or concerns. Everybody's like, well, I only have city water to irrigate with. What about the chlorine in the water? Is it going to kill the plants? No, you're good. Actually, the plants will use some of that chlorine, so it's not bad to have in the water. Would we like it a little less? Some of the city water can get pretty high in chlorine because they're trying to control something in that water supply. But overall, I would not worry about the chlorine with your plants from the city water. One of the bigger things, and I can't help you with it, but it's more expensive to water with city water. When you have to pay for that water by a meter specifically, it can really rack up. And so you might want to look at your landscape of how much water you want to run in demand. If you're on well water, Hard water is a big concern. You probably already know that. There are some people in the state of Wyoming that they're like, do you recommend any good sprinkler? Because my lawn sprinkler just chews up every year and I got to buy a new one because their water quality is so bad, hard water. But it also can be high in salts as well. Okay, so not that city water or surface water couldn't be high in salts. Your water quality matters, but you can really see it in well water pretty often.
Besides like the public safety test they do, where would you recommend sending, if you have well water, where would you recommend sending it to be tested for the salts and all that kind of stuff?
You can send it to an analytical lab. There's a lot of analytical labs, and you just need to tell them that it's for agriculture or crop growth, and they will run it for that. They won't run it against drinking water standards. And I would just talk to them before I sent it. I'm not sure if Colorado State University is still doing it. They used to have a plant and water lab at the university, and they would test it for you. I'm not as familiar with this area, so I don't know the labs. I know more north.
Colorado State University is usually 6 to 8 months backed up.
Oh,
So, yeah.
Colorado State is.
Ward Laboratories also.
Ward, I forgot about that one, thanks. Yep, Ward. But you don't have to go to an agriculture lab to do it. Ward, W-A-R-D. You can also go to an engineering lab. So up by me, there's like an energy lab and an IML lab out of Sheridan, some of those, and they will do water testing for you, but you just got to let it know it's for crop, not for drinking water, and if they can do that test for you. But it's not going to come back to you as like, this is great water, right? They're not going to dial it in that specific for you, but they will give you what you have in there, soluble salts, nitrates, those kind of things. Yep. Enclosed space production, we already talked about this, but I want to really emphasize it. But like we were talking about with all of these, understand in your enclosed space system, especially, and I hope it kind of comes together for you in terms of if you're doing drip irrigation system in a high tunnel, let's say, right? And I'm using well water that is high in salts for that water. That enclosed space is not getting that natural precipitation to help flush those salts through the soil profile. And so especially with those drip irrigations or more precise irrigation system, you can accumulate salt in your soils over time, and we're talking years, but you can raise the salt levels in your soil to where it's now not able to grow your plants, okay? And it has to do with that you're not filling that soil profile, you're not pushing those salts down with enough moisture and water to go through. Does that make sense? Next slide, please. Oh, why is this one here?
So are you saying if you overwater those areas, then that'll take care of it?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. No, we'll talk about it in a little bit. My big takeaway is monitor your moisture level, and that's why I showed you that KISS method of how you can do it yourself. But what you're really wanting to do is just monitor that availability in the moisture, because that's your battery, right? And those different irrigation styles and types really affect this, right? Because if you can fill that soil profile completely, like with surface irrigation, that plant can withstand longer periods and go longer and do well, even though it looks dry and bone dry on the soil surface, because it really matters what's underneath. Whereas your drip irrigation is not completely filling this soil profile, and thus you need to stay on top of it of when the moisture's out, we need to get more water to it, and it's going to be shorter frequency of your irrigation. Does that make sense? To your point of, you're just saying we need to overwater. To fix it, to a degree, okay? So if I was in that situation, if you had a way of overwatering, if you will, I would be looking at it in the springtime or in the fall after my growing, okay? Why I say that is because your ET rate is gone, right? In terms of that demand, you're not having that solar intensity in the structure. It's cooler, the water you put on stays on, and it'll work into that soil profile. The challenge is going to be two things. One is if you're doing a drip irrigation type, It's really, really hard just to fill the soil profile with a drip irrigation. You can do it, but it's hard, right? So you'll never get to the point where you're overwatering and flushing that soil with a drip irrigation system. So you got to go to a different method to where you are adding more water. You could, at that time, especially if you're not growing, you could put a sprinkler in or something like that, or go to something different. What was my other thought on that one?
What about if you have salt in your water?
I was going to go to that one too, but so that's the struggle and the concern with that one. The other factor of that is, and this is talking off of the principle that you have a good functioning soil that does drain well. If your soil doesn't drain well, overwatering is not going to help that, because if it won't drain through the soil profile, it'll just add more. But to Amy's point of, if you have well water or water that is just high in salts anyway, overwatering, we're just putting more salt out there. And so you really got to make sure you have good drainage to try and flush it and balance it. But it goes into a correlation of that soluble salts in the water and how much you're putting on. There's crop producers in the area that their salt levels are rising because of the water that they're irrigating with, no other reason. And that's what's so critical with our annual precipitation, is because when we get it in snow and rain, we're not bringing soluble salts with that. And so it's a way of leaching that out. We just don't get enough of it usually. Does that? So yes, it's overwatering, but we got to do it at the right time of year, spring and fall. But also, I'd be very concerned of my soil. I'd make sure my soil has good drainage before I was really doing that. Can't you just, you are overcomplicating it.
Yeah, no. Can't you use a filtration system? Like if you're going to use that same well water for your house, can't you just hook up that same filtration system and take some of that out, in a sense? I mean,
Answer is yes, right? So the simple answer is yes. If you jump to filtration, you're talking money. Right. Big money. No, I wouldn't hook it up to my house filtration system. So you need a more precise filtration system than what's on your house, depending on what's on your house, right? So if you're just doing a media filter on your house, you need more than that. A reverse osmosis, yes, will pull the salt out of your water and that. But if you ever have been around a reverse osmosis system, they don't generate a lot of good, clean water very quickly. Sure. And so the demand, what you're going to need for irrigating with, the volume of water you're talking is going to be a huge system, really expensive. And a lot of times they go into discs and media filter systems. So I've been to some farms in like Utah, I'm blanking, must have been just Utah. But anyway, they put in a filtration system because of the salts for an entire field. And I mean, we're talking like acres, like 30-acre fields, 50-acre fields, or whatever it is. But he had a whole, and it was a battery of different filters there to do it. And so yes, you can. It is expensive, and there's a lot of moving parts. And when you're in that, you would have to replace those too, because especially if you're in high salt, you will probably see a lot of corrosion on those pieces and have to replace them. But you definitely have to replace the media.
like a little bit higher than whatever.
Only a little bit. I only want a little bit, right? Well, so it boils back to just the volume of water it takes to grow plants, right? So if I had a raised bed as big as this, and that's as much water as I needed, and I was willing to swallow the dollar, right, to buy the media filter, could you afford it? Yes. Would you want to do it? Well, I'm a hobbyist, and I'll spend anything to do it, right? Yes, so you'll do it, right? And that's fine, and that's your decision and your understanding. But if I'm trying to filter enough water for this entire room, we're talking thousands of dollars at that point. So yes, filtration is an option. It's a lot of it quickly changes to economically unfeasible usually, but it is an option. Go win the lottery and you got it, right? Good question.
You talk a lot about trees, okay?
Oh man, okay.
You know it's coming.
It's coming, okay.
Winter watering techniques for trees around here. Like most of us, when we put our trees in, add a drip system to it at the beginning, winter watering tips, what do you got?
I'm going to back up first before I get to wintering watering techniques. So trees, the biggest problem I see with trees, I think it was Scott, I can't remember if it was Scott or Whitney Crenshaw that talked about, but the mulching, I think it was Whitney Crenshaw, the mulching around his trees. Nope, Scott, it was Scott, just Scott. He put mulching around his trees because grass is the worst thing you can have because it outcompetes the tree, okay? We don't irrigate the trees effectively usually. We do really good when they're baby trees for the first, 2 to 5 years of their life, and then after that we don't water them really well. They really need watered out at that drip line. It's really hard to accomplish. So first of all, that's where I'd be focusing is my irrigation throughout the growing season. And kind of like the overwatering concept, I'd really be banking water, giving them as much water as they can take in the spring and really pounding them in the fall and trying to maintain my good irrigation during the growing season just so they maintain water. But like with grapes in particular, but it goes into all woody trees, so it could be shrubs, it could be trees, anything woody, right? Going into the winter, if you could pick it, which we never can, but if you could go out there, turn on the water and fully saturate and soak that soil profile where the roots are, turn it off, and tomorrow it freeze in place, that's the best thing you can ever do. Soak and hydrate the heck out of them going into winter, okay? Then when I'm in winter, I will just make a mention. There's nothing wrong with drip irrigation. However, you struggle to accomplish that with drip irrigation and at the proper spacing to it, okay? But winter watering. I go into winter. So I'm going to explain my conditions, and I think it fits you guys pretty well. We did not really freeze, and I did not get frost in the ground at my place until January. You better be out there watering those trees until it freezes, okay? The problem with that is, and what I highly recommend is never jeopardize your infrastructure, your hoses, especially if it's hooked to your house. You can freeze the hoses, just don't freeze the hydrants and the house, okay? So drain your hoses. It's a pain, it's a fight to do that. So it means you got to irrigate in the daytime kind of thing. Once it freezes, I'm good. And I can't do anything more for that tree, and hopefully I've banked that battery of water for them to get through the winter. And mostly at that point, I want the water in the trunk and in the branches and in the tree itself. But I accomplish that by getting that soil profile hydrated, right? Go in, yep. Then in wintertime, we'll hit winters, not this one, but we'll hit some winters where we freeze in October, November, and all of a sudden in January we're 50 degrees, right? And it's like, holy cow. And if the frost is coming out of the ground and it's warm like that for a week or more, hook up your hoses and get back out there and start soaking them down and keep it soaked. Again, do not jeopardize your systems and your hydrants and your pipes and all that and get it unhooked. And so it's a hard thing to manage because if you're like me, I'm working during the day so I can't be home watering the trees. But that's what I'd recommend for watering.
When it comes to the solutions though for how to water, so like you said, when they're little babies, it's easy to point that drip irrigation right on over that root. But as they grow, they expand out. Would you, specifically talking winter watering,
okay?
What would you be using to winter water that? Is it something where you've got like a hose with like a little bit of those pop-up water irrigations, or are you using a soaker hose because it's next to the ground, or what is it that you're using, especially in winter watering?
Yes. Use it all. Use whatever. I personally go simple. A soaker hose is a great idea. But if you're going with a tree, like the baby tree, we just need to soak here, right? But once we're above 5 years old, we need to soak here, right? And so especially during winter, I don't think it's as big of a concern, but you could just lay that hose out there and let it soak this side, put the hose over here, not up against the trunk, but put it over on that side, let it soak that ground, that kind of. You can use a sprinkler system as well to cover that, because in the wintertime you don't have that grass competition, and that's where most of the trees I see is that grass competition, right? In the wintertime you don't have the grass competition, so you can do it that way. But those are the methods because it puts down the most water the fastest, right? Drip irrigation, in my opinion, it won't do it. Can you do it if you have the right drip system? But you need, so with a tree, if you're going to use drip irrigation system, they'll usually put an emitter right by the tree that puts out like a gallon or 2 gallons per minute kind of idea, you know. But then in 2 years, you better have a ring around that tree, and then in another year, it better be a bigger ring and a bigger ring. And unless you are in a nursery, nobody does that.
Yeah, can you just keep moving the ring out without refilling in the center between the outside ring? So you don't have to kind of keep like ring.
At nurseries, you'll see that they'll move it out and it'll be like 2 or 3 feet from the trunk, and there'll be a ring, and then another year they'll build another ring and leave that ring there. So they'll do that, yeah, but majority of the water's out there at the surface of the roots. But the trick is knowing where the roots are, and they always just call it the drip line is where you want that water at. But it's not always at where the roots are at, but you just don't want it right at the base of the trunk.
So in Laramie County, their tree program is they come out, they plant, and they put the landscaping fabric down, which is similar to water shedding tarp material, and they punch the hole, put the trees in. But so that kills pretty much all living things in the soil between trees. And then at what point do you suggest taking that material out and putting wood chips down? I know they're trying to prevent the competition with the grass around it, but in some sense, I feel like it's hurting the tree because it's not spreading out the roots, like you said, with the rings, because it's not getting the snow moisture because it all pretty much runs off to the sides. So I feel like it's...
How big of trees are they planting? Bare roots, little guys. And how big is that fabric, roughly?
About 2 feet on each side.
2 feet by 2 feet.
Yeah.
But it'll run off the side and encourage those roots to grow
It'll encourage
laterally.
it to work its way out, yeah.
I think when they get older, yeah. How many years?
Well, I mean, like we put them out. I live north of here, 60 miles, and we put them out, and the water will go through it, not real readily. But the problem is that when those trees get too big, then because that weed fabric won't. They say it disintegrates, it doesn't disintegrate ever. And so then it'll start girdling the tree. And then you just take it off and off you go.
So how fast, right? I would think there's so many variables it's hard to really say, but I think easily within 2 to 3 years, those roots are at that fabric or past it. If the tree is doing well. If the tree's not doing well, then there's something else going on that's not necessarily the fabric. In terms of how long do I leave the fabric there, and there is an old debate of should I do fabric or not do fabric kind of thing. I leave that up to a personal decision. There's nothing wrong with that fabric, especially in establishment, right? But once that tree's established, technically you shouldn't need that fabric unless you just want to use it as what it's meant to be, as a weed barrier, right? Because putting that fabric down, if it's well maintained and managed, it does do a good job of suppressing the grass from encroaching in, right? You do got to be worried about keep cutting that around the trunk so the trunk has plenty of space to keep spreading out. But I think at that 2 to 3 year mark, if you're the one like, I don't want this fabric, I don't want it on the landscape, you can get it gone, and it's accomplished what it needs to do. Now it's another level of management for that tree. Does that help answer?
I think I'd rather convert over to wood chips as soon as I can, because then you're encouraging other healthy soil underneath or around the tree, I think.
Yeah, so yes, that's fine, and I'm totally for it. We can argue it all day if it's better or not, whatever. If that's your decision, I support it. I think that's great. The biggest thing I just encourage you is if you go switch to wood chips, make sure those wood chips are not up against the tree. So you want probably a good 2 to 3 inch space between the trunk and the wood chip mulch, because the concern and what I have seen is people usually bank the wood chips up against the tree, and it kind of has this little volcano effect to the trunk. No, it doesn't suffocate it, but it decays it because it'll rot it with the moisture. It'll keep it too wet and rot it there. So if you keep the wood chips away from the trunk, the wood chips work, but you got to keep them away from the trunk, and then you won't rot that. That would be my only concern with the wood chips. And the sooner you go to it, great. My other beef with wood chips is everybody's like, oh, I want to put wood chips out in mulch and it's going to look good. And they put like, you know, an inch or an inch and a half. That doesn't, it helps with a little bit of moisture control there, right? But it doesn't do anything for a weed suppression or that. If you want weed suppression, you need to get deep. You need, 3, 4, 5 inches of wood chips to try and act as a weed suppression, so to speak. So it's up to the purpose of what you're trying to do with the wood chips. I'm good with that. I would probably go 2 to 3 years, take that fabric out, do what you want to do to groom it up for where you're putting the wood chips, however you want to do it. But just keep it away from the trunk would be my biggest recommendation.
Well, it wouldn't be all at once because I got 400 trees, so.
What? You're not going to get it done in a weekend?
Maybe 50 foot a year or something like that.
Yeah.
About as much
Yeah.
wood chips as I want to haul in.
Yep, I hear you. And I would also just say, I don't know what type of fabric they're using, and there is a ton of different types of fabrics out there. And there are some fabric that actually are porous and let the water through it. There are some that will rip up in like a year or two, and then there's some that are there for 15 years. Personally, I'd rather not see the landscape fabric out there. If it is out there, let's maintain it and keep it good. But when it starts ripping up and tearing, it's not doing its function. Let's get it out. And if we're burying it in the ground, it becomes a nightmare to remove. It's problematic. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions?
We did put up a snow fence on purpose about 10 feet from the back line of our county trees to capture the snow on top of the county trees.
Okay.
It worked really well.
Okay.
You look at the side we did it versus the side we didn't do it, and the trees that were covered with that snow during the winter time, they're much bigger than the ones that were on the end that the snow kind of just
blew off. Yep. Yeah, I could understand that, and I agree with that. The only thing I would say with that is specifically with evergreens, I'd be very concerned of banking that snow around them, because in certain years you can actually burn your evergreens because of the snow, and especially blue spruce, I want to say, is the big one, that it'll bury snow on top of it, and then all of a sudden in the springtime it's kind of like brown and crispy up here, and below it's all green and vibrant because the snow protected the lower branches, and it's the reflection and it dries it out and that. And so just the evergreens is the ones that especially a blue spruce, because they're a water hog anyway, I would not encourage you to plant blue spruce here. I'm sure there's tons out there. That would be my only concern with that, but it's totally a good way to trap snow and add more moisture to your system. Yeah.
Swales. Did you do swales on them?
Do what?
Swale. Some of the snow's going in that.
It can. Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, they call them wells or a swale or whatever, a ditch, or you can make a depression and try and trap that snow in there, and it can work. There's pros and cons to all of it, is what I would say with that. Yep.
If we already have established, like rows of lavender, how do I get the available area saturated when I already drip line in there? I throw an extra 7 rows down in.
Oh man, that's a good question. So you have an established row of lavender. 4 of them, pretty close together. Can you walk between them?
3 feet apart. They're 3 feet apart.
Wow, okay. And you have soaker hose laid in there.
They each have the emitter hoses right up
Okay.
underneath the plants themselves.
Okay. So how do you get in there and remove it or replace it or move it, is your question?
In there, but you said if I just have the emitters, I'm never going to get that available bank of water.
I would,
Especially since lavender doesn't like water.
right, so
It likes to search for water.
yeah, so you're okay with that type of plant. They don't like an abundance of water, so you're okay in that. But I just continue using the system. It is what it is, unless you really want to get in and cut it out and move the hose over a little bit. I would leave it and keep using it and keep watering until you see a problem with your plants, and then figure out if it is water, and if it is, then go in and do it.
No, they seem to be doing fine.
Then I wouldn't worry about it.
I was just like, oh shit.
No, if it's a dripper hose and you're irrigating, you can just bump up how long you irrigate for, or how frequently you irrigate for, to get them more water if that becomes a problem. But I wouldn't worry about it until you have a problem, so to speak, and then make sure it is irrigation, and then try and increase or change your irrigation management to change it. And if it doesn't change it, then try and change, like physically get in and change it.
Right.